Tonight, we open a door the Vatican would rather stay locked. Not to demons, not to monsters, but to something far more unsettling. Angels. Not the gentle figures in paintings, but ancient beings of fire and memory. Warriors who carried truths older than Eden itself. Truths that were buried, rewritten, and sealed beneath cathedrals for a reason. These angels didn't fall. They were silenced, because they remembered what came before creation as we know it. And in a world built on controlled stories, memory is the most dangerous weapon. So before we pull back the veil and speak the forgotten names, hit like, subscribe, and drop where you're watching from. Tonight, we don't hunt darkness. We follow the light, and it may burn brighter than heaven ever dared. For centuries, we've been told the story in black and white. Angels are pure, holy, and unfailingly good. But ancient writings, those older than any official scripture, paint a far more complex picture. In those early texts, angels don't arrive to soothe or comfort. They descend like storms. People collapse in terror. Voices shake the earth. Light burns like fire. These beings weren't gentle guardians. They were cosmic enforcers. But here's where the story twists. Some ancient accounts describe angels who didn't rebel out of pride or evil, but out of disagreement, challenging systems they believed were growing unjust. These angels taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Writing, astronomy, medicine, skills that gave humans independence, clarity, and power. Power that made people less reliant on religious intermediaries. One long-suppressed text tells of angels who chose to walk among humans, not to rule them, but to love and guide them directly. And for that, they were cast out, not because they defied God, but because they disrupted the hierarchy between heaven, earth, and institutions built in between. So imagine this. If angels could give humans wisdom that bypassed rituals, doctrines, and authority, wouldn't that threaten anyone who depended on controlling that flow of truth? Perhaps that's why certain writings were sealed away, why some visions were dismissed, why some angels were labeled fallen. Not because they were evil, but because they were free. Free to act, free to question, free to illuminate truths that no institution could contain. So the real mystery isn't whether angels exist. The mystery is why, throughout history, the most powerful voices worked so hard to shape how we see them. What were humans not meant to know? And what kind of angels were we never meant to remember? Not just messengers, not just warriors, but forces that could tear down the walls of false belief with a single word. And maybe that word has already been spoken. They never knocked. They didn't whisper. They arrived in bursts of fire, eyes like lightning, voices like earthquakes. And the strangest part? They were supposed to be on our side. In ancient texts, angels weren't the soft, smiling guardians we've been taught to picture. They were something else entirely. Something fierce, something unstoppable, and sometimes something dangerous. Long before they became gentle figures in stained glass windows, angels were known as messengers of fire and disruption. People didn't hug them. They fell flat on their faces, terrifying. Even prophets begged them to leave. These weren't beings of comfort. They were beings of command. In nearly every story, when an angel shows up, everything changes. They tear cities apart, they end plagues, they deliver warnings that spark wars. They don't ask questions. They carry orders from something higher than kings, higher than priests, higher even than what the church could ever fully control. And not all angels stayed in line. In the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest and most controversial texts ever written, a group of angels came down to earth, not to punish, not to protect, but to teach. They gave humans knowledge, astronomy, language, medicine, metallurgy, secrets meant only for heaven. They didn't just pass messages, they rewrote the script, and for that they were cursed, called fallen, blamed for corrupting humanity. But if what they gave helped humans grow, was it really corruption, or was it rebellion with a purpose? The Vatican banned the Book of Enoch centuries ago, said it was dangerous, heretical. But maybe the real danger wasn't what the angels did. Maybe the danger was what they revealed. That knowledge doesn't always come through priests. That truth doesn't always wear robes. That some divine messengers break the rules to help humanity rise. Even in the Bible itself, angels challenge the systems around them. An angel stops Abraham from committing a human sacrifice, overturning a tradition older than Judaism. Another appears to Balaam's donkey, before any prophet sees it, showing that divine truth doesn't always go through the expected channels. These stories suggest a quiet rebellion, a whisper of resistance from within the ranks of heaven itself. And here's where it gets even more strange. The word angel means messenger, not servant, not slave. They deliver what must be said, not always what others want to hear. They bring messages that threaten power, disrupt the status quo, and force people to choose between comfort and awakening. And when they do, they're not seen as heroes, they're seen as threats. So maybe the reason ancient people feared angels wasn't just because they were powerful, maybe it was because they couldn't be controlled. And if heaven itself sends beings that can't be silenced, can't be bribed, and won't obey anyone but truth itself, what does that mean for the people trying to rule in God's name? Maybe it means they're not the ones in charge after all. If angels really looked the way early texts described them, no one would hang one on their bedroom wall. They weren't cute, they weren't soft, and they definitely didn't have blonde curls and tiny golden harps. In the oldest stories before, paintings turned them into decorations. Angels were terrifying, not because they were evil, but because they were something so far beyond human understanding that just seeing one could break your mind. In the book of Ezekiel, one of the most ancient and strange descriptions of angels appears. They are called living creatures, but that doesn't do them justice. These beings had 4 faces: one of a human, one of a lion, one of an ox, and one of an eagle. Their bodies were covered in wings, and their wings were covered in eyes. They moved without turning, flying in any direction instantly, as if gravity didn't apply. Ezekiel saw wheels within wheels glowing with fire and spinning with awareness. That was how he described the angels that carried the throne of God. Not soft figures with halos, but burning, mechanical, eye-covered forces that made no sense at all. Even when angels took on a human shape, they didn't exactly blend in. In the book of Daniel, an angel appears wearing linen and a golden belt, with a face like lightning and eyes like flaming torches. His voice was like the roar of a crowd. Everyone who saw him fled in terror. Daniel himself collapsed and had to be lifted by the angel just to speak. The message was divine, but the experience was overwhelming. This wasn't a peaceful visit. It was a full-body shock that left even a prophet speechless. These early descriptions were raw. They weren't designed to comfort. They were meant to show just how foreign angels really were. They weren't from here. They weren't even close. And for centuries, people understood that. They feared angels not because they were evil, but because they were so powerful, so otherworldly. that to be in their presence meant feeling how small and fragile you really were. But over time, something changed. The fire was gone. The eyes, the noise, the energy that could shake mountains all erased. Why? Maybe because the real version didn't fit the story the church wanted to tell. A version where heaven was calm and organized, where divine power came only through the proper channels, not through spinning wheels of fire that showed up uninvited. The truth is, angels were never meant to be understood. They weren't created to make us feel safe. They were meant to remind us that there are forces out there bigger than laws, bigger than religion, bigger than anything a human could ever control. And when they showed up, they didn't ask for permission. They appeared in glory and terror, spoke only the truth, and left behind people who would never be the same again. Maybe that's why the church stopped talking about them like that. Because once you've seen the real thing, you stop listening to anyone who claims to speak in its place. There's a book the Bible doesn't want you to read. It's called the Book of Enoch, and for a long time it was completely forgotten, hidden, banned. It wasn't lost in a war or destroyed in a fire. It was removed in purpose. And when you read what's inside, you start to understand why. Because in the Book of Enoch, angels aren't just messengers. They're rebels. And what they gave humanity might have been the greatest gifter, the beginning of the fall. The story begins long before the time of Jesus, even before the flood of Noah. A group of angels called the Watchers were sent to earth to observe humans. They were supposed to stay invisible, to never interfere. But they didn't follow the rules. When they saw human women, they fell in love. And not just one or two angels saw of them. They took wives, had children, and created a race called the Nephilim. These weren't normal kids. They were giants, beings with incredible strength, strange powers, and knowledge far beyond anything humans had ever known. But that wasn't the only rule the Watchers broke. They also gave humanity secrets, things heaven had kept hidden. They taught people how to read the stars, make weapons, mix herbs into medicine, paint their faces with makeup, craft metal tools, use magic, summon spirits. Suddenly, humans weren't just surviving. They were evolving fast, too fast. God was furious. The Watchers had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. According to the Book of Enoch, they had polluted the earth not just with giants, but with knowledge, dangerous knowledge. So a punishment was sent, a great flood to wipe the slate clean. The Nephilim were destroyed. The Watchers were captured by other angels, loyal to God, chained beneath mountains, and sentenced to eternal silence. And Enoch, a human who had watched it all happen, was taken up into the heavens, not to die, but to write it down. This is the part the church never talks about. Because if angels could fall for love, if they could care about humans, if they could break divine law, not out of evil but out of compassion, what does that mean? What does it say about obedience, about rules, about who gets to decide what's good or bad? The Book of Enoch asks these questions, and that's why it was banned. The Vatican didn't just ignore it. They erased it from the Bible entirely. But some copies survived, in Ethiopia, hidden in ancient monasteries, and now anyone can read them. The story flips everything upside down. The fall wasn't just about sin. It was about knowledge, and the ones who tried to help us were punished forever. Maybe the Watchers weren't traitors. Maybe they were teachers. Maybe the real reason this book was buried is because it dares to show angels not as perfect servants, but as beings who chose truth, even when it cost them everything. And that kind of story is far more powerful than anything printed in gold on a church altar. The Book of Enoch was once considered holy. It was read by early Christians. It was quoted in ancient sermons. Even the Bible itself references it in the Book of Jude. But somewhere along the way, the book disappeared. It wasn't lost by accident. It was removed quietly, deliberately. And when you understand what's in it, the reason becomes clear. The Book of Enoch didn't just tell a story. It exposed a secret the church could never afford to let people believe. In this book, angels fall not because they were evil, but because they disobeyed orders to help humanity. They teach people forbidden knowledge. They question authority. They even create life. The whole idea of divine perfection gets messy. The Watchers, those angels sent to observe Earth, break the rules by falling in love with humans. They give people tools and wisdom. They don't act like servants. They act like protectors. But in the end, they're punished not just by God, but by the system they dared to challenge. Now imagine what happens when this book spreads. Suddenly, the image of angels as obedient warriors begins to crack. Suddenly, the church no longer looks like the only bridge between heaven and earth. If angels can care about humans enough to risk everything, if they can deliver truth outside of doctrine, if they can teach without permission, then what's the point of needing an institution to reach God? That's not just uncomfortable. That's dangerous for those in power. That's why the Book of Enoch was labeled heresy. Not because it was false, but because it didn't fit the story the church wanted told. It wasn't included in the Council of Nicaea when they decided what books would make up the official Bible. It wasn't copied into the Latin texts that the Vatican controlled. It wasn't translated, discussed, or taught. It was buried. For centuries, the book survived only in Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church kept it as part of their canon. Western Christianity forgot it even existed, and when it was finally rediscovered in the 18th century, the response wasn't excitement. It was silence. Scholars were warned. Priests ignored it. The Vatican never made an official statement. They didn't have to. The book had already been erased from belief. And yet the questions remain. If this book was once accepted, once respected, once quoted, what changed? Why would the church keep it hidden unless it threatened something deeper than just theology? Maybe it didn't fit the idea of divine order. Maybe it made heaven look too human. Maybe it made truth feel too personal. Because in the Book of Enoch, salvation doesn't come from following rules. It comes from knowing. And when knowledge becomes the path to truth, the gatekeepers lose their power. That's why the book was banned. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. There was a time when people believed knowledge came from the stars. Not from schools. Not from scrolls. But from beings who weren't supposed to share it. The Book of Enoch tells a story that turns everything upside down. According to its pages, the first scientists, doctors, and astronomers didn't learn their skills over time. They were taught by angels. And not just any angels. These were the Watchers. The ones who broke heaven's rules and gave humanity secrets no one was meant to have. It didn't start with war. It started with love. The Watchers were sent to observe humanity, but they became attached. Some say they fell in love. Others say they were drawn to the chaos and potential of human life. Either way, they chose to interfere, and what they gave changed everything. One angel taught humans how to make swords. Another revealed the secrets of metalworking, how to shape weapons, forge tools, melt gold. Another taught about the stars, how they moved, how to track seasons and time. One taught magic. Another taught the use of herbs and roots, for healing or for harm. At first glance, it seems like a gift. They gave people power. They pushed civilization forward. But with power comes consequences. With weapons came war. With sorcery came deception. With beauty, secrets came vanity and obsession. With star maps came arrogance. Humanity didn't just use the knowledge. They worshipped it. And in the eyes of heaven, that was the real danger. These angels didn't act out of hate. They didn't want to destroy. But by giving humans too much too fast, they disrupted the balance. They introduced ideas before people were ready. And once the knowledge spread, it couldn't be taken back. The line between divine teaching and dangerous temptation began to blur. Some called it enlightenment. Others called it corruption. And the church? They called it forbidden. Over time, the story was erased from mainstream religion. The idea that angels gave humans tools for war and magic didn't fit the image the church wanted. So they rewrote the story. Knowledge became something granted only through God's chosen institutions. Learning came from priests, not from fallen stars. And the Watchers were rebranded as villains, beings who tempted mankind, not teachers who cared. But the question still burns under the surface. Was it really wrong to teach? Or was it wrong to try and stop humanity from growing? Did the Watchers fall because they rebelled? Or because they dared to love the world too much? Some say the forbidden knowledge was a test. Others believe it was a spark, a gift we weren't supposed to receive, but needed anyway. The truth is, we still carry it. Every time we look through a telescope, every time we heal a wound, every time we shape metal or measure time, we are touching something ancient, something divine, or something defiant. And maybe that's why the story was hidden. Because it reminds us that knowledge can come from anywhere, even the sky. And sometimes those who bring it aren't welcome, not in heaven, and definitely not in the halls of power. Not every encounter with an angel ended with a blessing. Some ended with fear, others with silence, and a few with a kind of damage no one could see, but everyone could feel. In the oldest stories, when people met angels, they didn't walk away stronger, they walked away changed. Something in them cracked, some saw too much, some never spoke again, and some lost their sight completely. The light of heaven didn't always heal, sometimes it broke things. In the book of Daniel, the prophet sees a vision of an angel standing near a river. His face is like lightning. His eyes burn like fire. His arms and legs glow like polished metal. His voice sounds like the roar of a crowd. Daniel's strength leaves his body, he collapses, he can't speak. His friends run. Even after the angel helps him stand, Daniel says he's shaking, he's sick, and this is someone who's supposed to be favored by God. In the New Testament, Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paulus, traveling when a light flashes from the sky. It's so bright, so overwhelming, that he falls to the ground. He hears a voice, but sees no one. When he opens his eyes, he's blind for 3 days. No food, no water, just silence and darkness. The experience leaves him changed forever. He becomes one of the most important figures in Christian history, but that change started with trauma, not peace. These encounters aren't rare. Ezekiel sees wheels of fire and creatures with wings and eyes. He sits in shock for 7 days. Isaiah sees the throne of God and screams that he's ruined. The shepherds at Jesus' birth tremble with fear. The angel has to tell them not to be afraid, but the fear was already there. Over and over, the pattern repeats. Humans meet something holy, but instead of feeling calm, they feel undone. This isn't what most people expect. We've been taught to believe that contact with the divine is gentle, beautiful, but the real stories say otherwise. The light that surrounds angels isn't soft. It's blinding, and when it hits, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't knock politely. It explodes into your life and burns away everything fake. What's left is raw, honest, and sometimes too much to handle. The church rarely talks about this side of angels, the painful side, the overwhelming light, the silence that follows. Maybe because it doesn't fit the picture they want to show. Maybe because if people knew what true divine contact really looked like, they wouldn't turn to priests for answers. They'd prepare for something far more intense. Something that doesn't comfort, but transforms. And transformation isn't always pretty. Because real light doesn't just shine, it exposes. It reveals the truth about everything, including yourself. And when that truth comes from something not of this world, even prophets tremble. Even saints fall. Even the chosen lose their strength. Maybe that's the price of touching heaven. Not peace but power. The kind that leaves a mark you never fully recover from. Not every vision from heaven brings peace. Some bring doubt. Some bring fear. And some leave even the holiest people wondering if what they saw was truly from God at all. You'd think saints would be the first to trust any voice from above. But again and again, in the oldest writings and journals of the most devout figures in history, there's a warning. Not every light comes from heaven, and not every being that calls itself an angel is what it claims to be. Saint Teresa of Avila, one of the most famous mystics in Catholic history, spent her life having visions and spiritual encounters. But even she admitted she couldn't always tell the difference between divine presence and something pretending to be divine. She wrote that some visions left her unsettled, not uplifted, that she was taught by her spiritual guides to question every light, every voice, no matter how beautiful it seemed. If it made her feel pride or control or power, she said it might not be from God. Saint Anthony of the Desert, one of the early fathers of monastic life, once locked himself away to battle temptation and grow closer to the divine. But in the silence of the wilderness, he claimed he was visited by glowing beings. Some praised him. Some told him he had reached perfection, that he no longer needed to pray. And that's when he knew something was wrong. He realized the visions weren't tests from God. They were traps, lies designed to distract him from humility and lead him toward pride. Even St. Paul, after his blinding vision of Christ, warned the early churches about false messengers. In his letter to the Corinthians, he wrote that even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. That's not poetic language. That's a serious warning. Paul, who experienced divine contact firsthand, understood that light doesn't always mean truth, and that sometimes the most dangerous lies come wrapped in beauty. This fear wasn't paranoia, it was wisdom. These saints knew something we're rarely told, that spiritual encounters are real, but not all of them come from the same source. Some lift you up, others lead you away, and the hardest part? They can look exactly the same. The church used these warnings as justification to control who was allowed to speak about visions at all. If you were a peasant who claimed to see an angel, you were often labeled possessed or mad. If you were a monk or nun with unusual visions, you had to submit them for approval. And if your story didn't match doctrine, you were silenced. Because too much light, especially if it couldn't be controlled, was treated as a threat. So even the saints, the holiest people in history, walked carefully around divine visions. They didn't rush to trust the light. They questioned it. They tested it. They feared it. Because deep down they knew what few are brave enough to admit, that not every glow comes from God. And sometimes, the scariest trick of all, is when something unholy knows how to shine. Most people think of the devil as the opposite of God. A horned monster ruling some fiery underworld, whispering evil into the ears of sinners. But that version is mostly myth and medieval storytelling. The truth is far stranger and far more dangerous. Because the devil wasn't always the enemy. He wasn't even always called the devil. His original name was Lucifer, and he was an angel, a bright one, powerful one, maybe even the brightest of them all. Lucifer means light bringer or morning star. That alone should make you pause. The church paints him as pure darkness, but his name says otherwise. He wasn't born in fire or hate. He was created in light, crafted like the other angels, with beauty, purpose, and authority. Some stories even say he stood closer to God than any other. He wasn't just a servant. He was a leader. So what happened? According to tradition, Lucifer fell because of pride. He wanted to rise higher, to be like God, to rule rather than serve. But when you look closer at the old texts, it's not just about arrogance. It's about rebellion. Lucifer questioned the structure. He challenged the design. He asked why beings with such power must always obey, why love must come with obedience. And for that, he was cast down. But here's the part most people miss. Lucifer didn't fall looking like a beast. He didn't grow horns or hooves. He remained what he was, an angel. Beautiful, brilliant, radiating light. That's what makes him so dangerous. Not because he's easy to spot, but because he isn't. He doesn't look like darkness. He looks like hope, like wisdom, like truth. The kind that feels right even when it leads you in the wrong direction. In the New Testament, Paul writes that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. Not as a monster, not as a demon, but as something holy, something divine. And that's what makes the line between good and evil so blurry. Because sometimes what you see looks right, feels right, sounds right, but leads you into ruin. The church has always struggled with this. How do you warn people about a being that appears beautiful, that can quote scripture, inspire visions, and imitate holiness? The answer for many centuries was fear. Don't trust your instincts. Don't question authority. If anything feels too strange, too bright, too personal, call it temptation. Blame the devil. Silence the doubt. Follow the rules. But the deeper truth is harder to swallow. Lucifer wasn't created to be evil. He was created to be radiant. His fall wasn't about ugliness. It was about disobedience, about choosing freedom over blind worship. And whether you see that as evil or brave depends on where you stand. That's why he's the mirror. Because in him, we see a reflection of what angels can be and what humans might become when they stop obeying and start asking why. Perfect obedience sounds like a good thing. In stories, it's what angels are known for. They follow orders. They carry out the will of heaven without question. No hesitation. No mistakes. That's what makes them angels, right? But what happens when that perfect obedience doesn't line up with what the church teaches? What happens when angels follow God but not the people who claim to speak for him? That's the part no one talks about. Because in the oldest texts, angels don't always follow human authority. They don't report to priests or popes. They answer to something higher. And when that higher power gives a command that doesn't match what the church is saying, the angels choose heaven, not Rome. In the Bible, an angel tells Joseph in a dream to take Mary and the baby Jesus and flee to Egypt. No priest gave him that order. It came straight from the divine. In Acts, an angel breaks Peter out of prison. No one asks permission. It just happens. Again and again, angels show up in the story doing what they were sent to do. No ceremony, no approval, just pure, direct obedience to a source beyond human reach. That's what scared the Vatican. Because for centuries, the Church positioned itself as the only bridge between humanity and God. If you wanted forgiveness, you went to a priest. If you wanted guidance, you listened to a bishop. The Pope wasn't just a leader. He was called the vicar of Christ, God's voice on earth. So the idea that angels could appear to someone outside the system, deliver truth without filters, and act with power greater than any human leader, that was dangerous. That meant the church wasn't in control. Real angels don't wait for permission to act. They don't ask if their message is politically convenient. They don't follow protocol. They do what's right even if it breaks the rules. And sometimes the truth they bring is uncomfortable. Sometimes it challenges tradition. Sometimes it exposes corruption. And that's when obedience stops being a comfort and starts becoming a threat. The Vatican couldn't erase angels from Scripture, but it could soften their image, make them polite, quiet, manageable. Paint them on ceilings with gentle eyes and folded hands. Teach people that angels only show up to announce births or protect travelers. Take away their fire, their independence, their judgment. Because if people really understood how powerful angels are and how loyal they are only to truth, then the church's authority would start to crack. Because obedience to God doesn't always look like obedience to religion. And when someone listens to the voice of heaven instead of the voice from the pulpit, they stop being a follower. They start being free. That's the problem with perfect obedience. If it's not to you, it can never be controlled. And that's exactly what true angels are. Uncontrolled, uncompromised, loyal only to the truth. Even when that truth burns through every lie, pretending to be holy, not all angels are the same. That's what ancient texts say, even if modern religion barely mentions it. According to early Christian and Jewish sources, heaven is structured. There isn't just one kind of angel. There are 9 different ranks, each with their own roles, powers, and authority. But only a few names are ever taught in churches. The rest are hidden, lost, or worse, forbidden to speak out loud. At the top of the hierarchy are the seraphim, said to burn with pure fire and circle the throne of God endlessly, singing holy songs no human can understand. Then there are the cherubim, not baby-faced and smiling like in paintings, but terrifying winged guardians who protect divine secrets. Below them are thrones, radiant beings that carry the justice of heaven itself. These 3 orders are said to be the closest to the source of all creation, almost impossible to imagine, let alone describe. The next level down includes dominions, virtues, and powers. They regulate the heavens, keep the stars in line, and guide the flow of spiritual energy. These angels don't usually appear to humans. They operate behind the scenes, shaping the world in ways we'll never see. The lowest three are the ones people are most likely to encounter: principalities, archangels, and angels. These are the messengers, the protectors, the ones who appear in dreams or at moments of crisis. They're still powerful, but they're closer to us. That's the official version. But what most people don't know is that the Church didn't come up with this list. It was borrowed from early mystics and philosophers, especially a mysterious figure named Pseudo-Dionysius. His writings on angelic hierarchies were considered sacred for centuries, yet the Vatican never included most of it in public teachings. They picked and chose which angels people were allowed to learn about, and which ones were better left in silence. Why? Because some names carry power. Some names, when spoken, are said to summon attention from forces beyond this world. Ancient texts warn that certain angelic names should only be said in prayer, and others not at all. The higher the rank, the more dangerous the contact. You don't just call on a throne or a virtue like they're waiting on the other end. These are forces older than time itself, and not all of them are patient. The Vatican has pages and pages of angelic names buried in old manuscripts. Some were copied in secret by monks who weren't supposed to have access. Others were recorded by mystics and immediately banned. Over time, only a few names made it to the surface. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Safe names. Familiar ones. The rest locked away. But there's a reason those names were feared. It's not because they were evil. It's because they were too powerful, too unfiltered, too close to the truth. And when you say their names, it's not just you calling them. It's them calling something back. Maybe that's why the Church doesn't talk about the full hierarchy anymore. Because once you understand how many kinds of angels there really are, and how close some of them might still be, you stop thinking of heaven as a quiet place, and you start to realize it might be listening. They were supposed to follow orders. That's what angels were made for. At least, that's what most people think. But buried deep in ancient texts and forgotten stories are moments where angels didn't obey. Not because they were evil. Not because they fell. But because something inside them chose freedom, and not just for themselves, for us. It's one of the strangest things in religious history. These beings, crafted to carry out the will of the divine without question, sometimes stopped. They hesitated. They said no. And when they did, something important was revealed. That even among the highest ranks of choice still matters. One of the most famous examples comes from the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is about to sacrifice his son because he believes it's what God wants. But at the last moment, an angel appears and stops him. It doesn't ask. Commands. Do not lay a hand on the boy. The Bible doesn't say whether the angel was told to step in, or if it made that choice on its own. But the timing is strange. Why wait until the very last second? Why let the knife get that close? Some scholars believe the angel acted on instinct, that it chose mercy before it was ordered to. Another strange case is found in the book of Genesis, just after Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. God places angels called cherubim at the entrance to the garden, armed with flaming swords. Their job is to block the way back. But some mystical texts from the early centuries say not all of them agreed. That one angel looked at the humans, frightened, ashamed, completely lost, and wept. That angel, according to legend, left its post and followed them, whispering comfort when the world grew too dark. It wasn't punished. It just disappeared from the story, vanished into the silence of myth. Then there are the Watchers, the angels who came to earth in the Book of Enoch. They defied the command to observe only. They taught humans forbidden knowledge. They loved human women. They broke rules. But what if they did it to help? What if they believed we had a right to grow, to learn, to choose? If angels are perfect, how can they make decisions like that? The answer might be that perfection doesn't mean blind obedience. It means knowing when obedience causes harm. These angels didn't betray heaven. They protected freedom, human freedom, the ability to choose our path even when it leads to mistakes. The church rarely talks about these stories. They're too messy, too unpredictable. They suggest that even divine messengers think for themselves, that they have hearts, doubts, and moments where they see pain and choose compassion over commands. And if that's true, it changes everything. Because it means the most powerful beings in creation don't just follow rules. They listen, they feel, and sometimes they choose love over law. That's not failure. That's something even greater. That's grace. Gabriel is the angel everyone thinks they know. The calm messenger. The one who tells Mary she's going to give birth to Jesus. The one who appears in shining robes, glowing softly, delivering news that changes the world. That's the version most people hear about in Sunday school, but it's not the full story. Because Gabriel didn't just deliver sweet messages, he also spoke terrifying truths. Prophecies so intense, so mysterious, that the church later chose to silence them. Long before Gabriel ever visited Mary, he showed up in the book of Daniel. And that version of Gabriel is nothing like the calm, smiling figure painted on church walls. In Daniel's vision, Gabriel appears in blazing light, and his presence knocks the prophet to the ground. Daniel gets physically sick from the encounter. What Gabriel says isn't comforting, it's overwhelming. He speaks of empires rising and falling, of kings who defy heaven, of a final war that would shatter everything. He talks about a timeline, weeks and years, sealed events, a future that will come, but not yet. It's cryptic, terrifying, and full of warnings. Some of those warnings were never explained, and some of the interpretations were buried. Because if people took Gabriel's words seriously, they'd start questioning everything. They'd see that history wasn't random, that power moves in cycles, that prophecy didn't end with Jesus, it kept going, and that terrified the Vatican. In the early centuries, there were texts called apocryphal that claimed Gabriel revealed even more, that he visited other prophets and mystics, that he delivered secrets about the end of time, the return of the Watchers, and a coming era when truth would be hidden under layers of gold and ritual. One document claimed Gabriel warned that the church itself would someday try to sit in the place of heaven, not to serve God, but to control belief. That text was burned. Another suppressed prophecy tied to Gabriel told of a child born not to rule, but to dismantle power structures, a bringer of knowledge, not just salvation. A figure who would speak with the voice of heaven, but refuse every title given by man. Some believed this figure would come at the end of the age. Others thought he already had, and the message was ignored. Gabriel was feared for what he said, because his words didn't serve power. They shook it, they didn't flatter rulers, they warned them, and they didn't leave people feeling cozy. They left them awake. So over time, the more dangerous prophecies were sealed, edited, or left out entirely. Gabriel was trimmed down into something safe. A messenger, but not a threat. A voice, but not a fire. But the truth is still out there, scattered in forgotten texts and banned scrolls. The prophecies were never erased completely, just buried deep enough that most people would never think to look. Because the real Gabriel didn't just announce births, he announced endings, and not everyone was ready to hear what came after. Some visions were never meant to be read, not because they were lies, but because they said too much. In dusty archives under Vatican stone, there are pages of prophecies that once burned with fire, visions of angels, warnings of corruption, glimpses of heaven that didn't follow the rules. And instead of sharing them, the church quietly blacked them out. Whole sections, whole books, redacted, edited, hidden. Not because they were false, but because they didn't match the story the church was trying to tell. Throughout history, mystics, saints, and visionaries wrote down what they saw. They described glowing figures with wings of light, voices like thunder, and eyes that saw through time. Some visions were approved, celebrated, turned into holy books, but others were locked away. The ones where angels questioned priests, the ones where heaven warned about false leaders in robes, the ones where truth came not through the church but around it. One of the most famous cases is the third secret of Fatima. 3 children in Portugal claimed to see the Virgin Mary in 1917. She gave them 3 messages. The first 2 were released quickly. The third was kept hidden for over 80 years. When it was finally published, something fell off. It was short, vague, almost too simple. Researchers and scholars believed the real vision had been edited, that it originally warned of corruption inside the church, that it spoke of betrayal from within, not some distant enemy. But the official version avoided all that. There are other cases too. Writings from Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun who had powerful visions of angels and cosmic order. Some of her works were carefully copied. Others were lost for centuries. Why? Because some claimed she saw church leaders twisting divine law, that angels wept at how truth had been chained, that real holiness had nothing to do with titles or wealth. Those words were too risky to keep public. Even the writings of Saint Francis of Assisi were trimmed. He saw angels in nature, not in cathedrals. He spoke of hearing God in the wind, not from pulpits. Some of his visions included warnings about how the church would someday become obsessed with gold and forget its own soul. Parts of his journals are missing, pages torn or rewritten. The pattern is clear. When an angel in a vision said something that supported church power, it was preserved. But when that angel spoke against dogma, it was erased or rewritten or declared heresy. It's easy to control what people believe when you control what they read. By hiding the most dangerous visions, the church shaped heaven into something safe, predictable, silent. But the real visions, the ones that burn too bright to be tamed, are still out there. In scattered manuscripts, in whispered legends, in half-translated texts buried in forgotten libraries. And maybe that's what the angels wanted all along. Not to be worshipped, but to be remembered, even if only in fragments, even if only in the silence between the lines. Imagine believing that everything you were taught about God was a lie, that the shining beings praised in churches weren't always what they seemed, that some of them, maybe even most, were working for something darker, pretending to be divine. That's what the early Gnostics believed, and it's one of the reasons their writings were banned, burned, and buried. The Gnostics were one of the first groups of Christians, but their version of the story was different. They believed that the material world wasn't made by the highest God, but by a lower, false god called the Demiurge. This being thought it was the true creator, but it wasn't. It was blind, arrogant, and obsessed with control. And worse, it had help. The Gnostics claimed this false god was surrounded by archons, powerful spiritual forces that acted like angels, but weren't. They created rules, systems, religions. They made people worship them as divine beings, while keeping them blind to the real source of truth. To the Gnostics, salvation wasn't about obeying, it was about waking up. They believed that inside every human was a spark from the true divine realm, a hidden light. And the only way to return to the real God was to break free from the lies, the rituals, the fear. The Gnostics warned that some angels might guide you, but others might trap you. Some would lead you to freedom. Others would demand your worship to keep you asleep. This idea terrified the early church. If people believed that spiritual beings could lie or deceive, how could the church prove it was telling the truth? If angels weren't always on the same side, who was safe to follow? The Gnostic warnings shattered the clean line between good and evil, between heaven and earth. It was messy, unpredictable, and dangerous to anyone trying to build authority. So the church responded by wiping them out. By the 4th century, Gnostic texts were declared heresy. Their teachers were exiled or killed. Their books vanished until 1945, when a collection of ancient scrolls was found hidden in a cave near Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Inside were Gospels no one had seen in almost 1,600 years. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, and in them the same strange message. Beware of beings who claim to speak for God, but demand obedience without offering understanding. The Gnostics weren't saying all angels were evil. They were saying that true divinity can't be forced. It doesn't need temples or gold or fear. It speaks quietly inside. And sometimes the loudest voices in religion are the ones trying hardest to cover it up. So when a glowing being appears in a vision, shouting commandments or offering power, the Gnostics would ask, is this light leading me back to myself or away from it? That's the warning they left behind. Not to reject faith, but to question what claims to be holy, to remember that even light can lie, and that the truth, the real truth, might be something only you can hear. There are gospels you've never heard of, not because they were lost, but because they were buried, left out on purpose. When the early church decided which books made it into the Bible, they didn't just pick the best ones. They picked the ones that supported their version of the story. The rest, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, were labeled dangerous and locked away. And when you read what's inside them, you understand why. These Gospels talk about angels, but not the way Rome wanted. In the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene isn't just a follower. She's a teacher, a visionary. After Jesus dies, she tells the disciples about a secret message he gave only to her. In it, she describes a journey the soul takes after death past angelic gatekeepers who try to block it. Each one demands answers, tests her, challenges her right to rise. This isn't the soft image of angels guarding the sky. These angels are powerful forces who stand between you and freedom, and you don't get past them just by following rules. You have to know who you are. That's the first reason this gospel was silenced. It didn't put angels in the role of helpers. It showed them as obstacles, not evil but strict. And it gave power to someone the church later pushed to the sidelines, Mary, a woman with knowledge no one else had. In the Gospel of Philip, the message goes deeper. This text speaks about the relationship between humans and angels in strange and intimate ways. It suggests that the divine spark inside people comes from a place higher than the angels. That we weren't made to serve them, we were made to awaken. Philip says that the rulers of the world, the archistry to keep humanity in ignorance, they want obedience, not understanding. And some of these rulers appear as angels of light. Again, we see a warning. Just because something glows doesn't mean it's good. Just because it carries a message doesn't mean it speaks the truth. These writings taught early Christians to think for themselves, to look inward, to trust experience over ritual, to listen to the still voice within, even when it doesn't match what's preached from the pulpit. Then there's the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings, many of which sound nothing like the version told on Sunday mornings. In this gospel, Jesus says the kingdom of God is already here but hidden. He says the divine is inside you and all around you, not in temples, not in institutions, but in awareness. He never mentions worshiping angels. Instead, the focus is on awakening, waking up from the illusion, seeing clearly, knowing yourself. Rome couldn't allow that. If people believed they didn't need priests to access heaven, the whole system would collapse. If they thought angels weren't always guides, but sometimes guards, they might ask too many questions. So the apocryphal Gospels were erased, their scrolls hidden in jars, their followers labeled heretics, but they didn't vanish completely. And now, centuries later, their voices are rising again, whispering the same dangerous truth. The path to heaven was never locked. You just have to stop asking permission to walk it. There's a line angels aren't supposed to cross. They can deliver messages. They can warn. They can comfort or protect. But in some ancient stories, an angel went further. It didn't just speak of heaven. It revealed how everything works. The stars, the planets, the realms above and below. It explained the structure of the cosmos itself. And when that knowledge reached human ears, something shifted. Not just in belief, but in control. Because once people understood how the universe truly operated, they started asking the one question the church feared most. Why do we need you? In the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest and most censored texts in religious history, there's an angel named Uriel. He doesn't just appear with light and music. He teaches. He pulls back the sky and shows Enoch the machinery behind it all. How the sun and moon move in perfect rhythm. How the stars aren't random, but placed like gears in a great cosmic clock. He speaks of portals in the sky, winds that carry time, and vaults of fire that store judgment. Uriel doesn't ask for worship. He offers understanding, and that made him dangerous. For early priests trying to control how people thought about heaven and earth, this was a nightmare. If angels could give you answers about the universe, what was the point of the church's version of creation? If someone like Enoch, a human with no temple, no title, could receive such secrets, then truth wasn't limited to sacred buildings or holy robes. Could come directly from the sky. Some later texts went even further. They described angels showing humans how to read the movement of the stars, how to track eclipses, predict seasons, measure time. This wasn't magic. It was science hidden inside revelation. But once the church took power, it worked hard to draw a thick line between the two. Science was labeled as a threat. Astrology was banned. And any knowledge that didn't go through their hands first was called heresy. What if that's because the angel spoke too much? Uriel and others like him weren't teaching rebellion. They were offering clarity. They gave humans tools to understand their place in the cosmos, not as slaves to mystery, but as participants in something bigger. They didn't say bow down. They said look up. And that shift from worship to wonder is what terrified the Vatican, because a questioning mind is a free mind. And a free mind is hard to control. So over time, angels like Uriel were removed from sermons. The Book of Enoch was erased from the Bible. Stories that hinted at deeper knowledge were labeled Gnostic or occult. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too right, too open, too bold. But truth has a way of surviving. In fragments, in symbols, in stories that won't go quiet. Somewhere the angel is still speaking, still pointing to the stars, still waiting for someone to listen. Not with fear, but with curiosity. Because maybe heaven was never meant to be a secret. Maybe it was always meant to be understood. The Church has always claimed to be the one and only bridge between God and man. If you wanted forgiveness, you went to a priest. If you wanted truth, you listened to a bishop. If you wanted salvation, you followed the rules laid out by Rome. For centuries, that was the system. No shortcuts, no exceptions. But there was a problem. Angels. From the beginning of Scripture, angels have appeared to ordinary people. No temples, no rituals, no clergy standing in the middle. Just raw, direct connection between heaven and earth. It happened again and again. Abraham, Mary, Joseph, Daniel, and even shepherds in the field. None of them were priests. None of them were trained. And yet the divine reached out anyway. That simple fact shook the foundation of everything the Church was trying to build. If angels can deliver truth straight from the source, why do you need someone else to interpret it for you? If God can speak to you through a dream, or a flash of light, or a voice in your heart, why must you confess through a wall, or follow a chain of command to be heard? The idea that heavenly beings can show up in anyone's life and change it completely makes religion feel less like a system and more like a relationship. And that's something the Church couldn't control. Over time, the image of angels was softened. They became background figures, decorations for Christmas cards, winged comforters who show up when you're scared, but never say anything too bold. The old stories where they gave direct commands, predicted the future, or challenged powerful leaders were buried or rewritten. Angels were turned into symbols, not messengers, not agents, definitely not teachers. But the truth still lingers in the pages of ancient texts. Angels didn't wait for permission to act. They didn't check with Rome before speaking. They showed up where they were needed. They delivered visions that sometimes matched doctrine, but often didn't. In some stories, they even warned people about false prophets and corrupt leaders. They didn't work for the Church. They worked for something higher. And that's where the real threat came in. Because if a person can be touched by the divine without going through the official structure, the structure starts to crack. Power shifts. Control fades. People stop being passive followers and start becoming seekers. They stop waiting for permission to experience God and start listening for the voice already speaking to them. The Church tried to hide that, to remind people that angels were part of their world, not yours. But heaven has never followed rules. It breaks into lives unannounced. It speaks to the lost, the young, the broken, the curious. And sometimes it does so through beings made of light and fire, who don't answer to anyone but truth itself. Those are the divine intermediaries, not chained to altars, not silenced by titles, just messengers, waiting, watching, and ready to remind you that maybe, just maybe, you were never that far from heaven after all. There's a moment when a spark becomes a fire, when a whisper from the divine turns into something too loud to ignore. And that's the moment the Vatican gets nervous. Because revelation, true, raw, uncontrollable revelation, doesn't follow protocol. It doesn't ask for approval. It doesn't wait for a council or a bishop's blessing. It just arrives. And when it does, it shakes everything. The Church says it believes in revelation. It teaches that God can speak through people, through saints, through Scripture, but only under certain conditions. Only through the proper channels. And only if it doesn't challenge the established system. That's where the line gets blurry. Because real revelation doesn't always come wrapped in Latin or gold. Sometimes it comes through a poor mystic in the woods. A child with a vision. A dream that won't go away. And when those revelations question church authority, things get complicated fast. Throughout history, people have claimed to receive divine messages, warnings, visions, prophecies. Some were canonized. Others were silenced. What made the difference wasn't always the content. It was who the message threatened. If a vision reinforced church teachings, it was praised. If it challenged them, it was dangerous. Take the case of Giordano Bruno. He saw the universe as infinite, filled with countless stars and worlds. He believed creation was bigger than anyone had imagined, and that the divine spoke through nature as much as Scripture. The Church didn't just disagree. They burned him, not because he hated God, but because his ideas didn't fit the structure. Or look at the many visionaries throughout time who said angels spoke to them. Some were believed. Others were accused of heresy. The line between holy and heretic wasn't always drawn by truth. It was drawn by control. The Church had to protect the system. And when revelation threatened to rewrite the rules, it became a problem. This is why the Vatican has always been cautious with visions. Every time a miracle is reported, or a prophecy emerges, it goes through a long, slow process of investigation. That might sound like wisdom, but it's also about containment, making sure nothing gets too wild, too free, too disruptive. Because deep down, revelation is dangerous. It reminds people that God is not confined to cathedrals or books, that the divine voice still speaks, and not just to popes. It reminds people that truth is alive, and living truth doesn't always respect walls. That's the fine line. Divine inspiration can strengthen the Church, but theological insubordination threatens its foundation. And both can look exactly the same on the surface. A vision, a voice, a burning need to speak what you've seen. The question isn't whether God still speaks. It's whether we're brave enough to listen when that voice says something new, something uncomfortable, something that doesn't come from Rome, but from somewhere much higher. In the year 363 AD, something strange happened. A group of bishops gathered in the ancient city of Laodicea, in what is now modern-day Turkey. Their goal was to clean things up, to organize the growing Christian movement, to draw clear lines between what was allowed and what wasn't. And buried deep in the list of rules, they created Canon 35 to be exactus. Command that sounds almost out of place. It says Christians must not pray to angels. This one sentence, quiet, easy to miss, but that tiny rule reveals something huge. Because you don't ban something unless it's already happening. Which means at that time people were worshiping angels. Not as decorations, not as side characters in a Bible story, but as real, powerful beings they turned to for help, guidance, and protection. And that made the church nervous. Why? Because angel worship was something the bishops couldn't control. Angels don't report to Rome. They don't appear on command. They don't need priests to speak through. When people prayed to angels, they were bypassing the entire structure, going straight to the source. And that terrified the early church. Think about it. If someone has a vision of an angel who tells them to live differently, to challenge authority, or to follow their own path, what happens next? That person suddenly holds power. Not political power, but spiritual influence. And if enough people start listening, the system cracks. The Council of Laodicea wanted to stop that, so they declared it illegal. Not just discourage banned. They called it superstition, a distortion. But what they were really doing was cutting off a connection. One that had been alive since the beginning of human belief. Before this council, stories of angelic contact were common. Farmers claimed angels helped them survive storms. Mothers swore they saw winged beings watching over their children. Hermits and mystics received visions that changed the way they saw the world. These weren't fringe stories. They were woven into the fabric of early Christianity. And many of them didn't need a church to make sense. By banning angel worship, the bishops weren't just tidying up doctrine. They were taking back control. They were saying, if it doesn't come through us, it's not real. If you want access to heaven, you'll need us to guide you. But the irony is, angels had always been intermediaries, messengers between heaven and earth. Their entire job was to break through barriers, to show up in fields, in dreams, in moments of crisis, to speak without permission. And by trying to silence that, the Council of Laodicea wasn't protecting truth. It was fencing it in. The ban didn't erase angel belief. It just drove it underground, into secret prayers, into hidden texts, into quiet moments where someone looks up at the sky and still believes someone is listening. Because no council can stop that. No rule can undo the oldest connection of all. One between the human Sioux land, the light that sometimes answers it. Walk into any old cathedral and you'll find angels everywhere. Painted on ceilings, carved into wood, standing as golden statues with delicate wings and peaceful faces. They look gentle, beautiful. Some are holding harps. Others are blowing trumpets or watching quietly from stained glass windows. But here's the strange part. These aren't the most powerful angels. Not even close. The real ones, the ones described in the oldest texts, the ones who shake mountains and blind prophets, they're missing, never shown, silent and invisible. Almost like the church doesn't want you to know they exist. It's not an accident. In Scripture, the most powerful angels aren't easy to look at. The seraphim are described as beings made of fire, with 6 wings and voices that shake the heavens. The cherubim have 4 faces. Human, lion, eagle, and oxen are covered in eyes. The thrones blaze like spinning wheels of light. These aren't soft or sweet. They're terrifying, holy in a way that feels overwhelming. But you won't find them on any church wall. Not really. Not the way they're described. Instead, what you see is a version that's been cleaned up, made pretty, made safe. Why? Because images are powerful. When people walk into a church and see a gentle angel smiling down at them, it creates a certain feeling, one of peace, of safety, of order. That's the version of heaven the church wants you to believe in. A place where everything makes sense, where angels follow the rules, where the divine is soft and manageable. But that's not what the oldest stories say. Real angels are wild, untamed. They don't wait for permission. They don't explain themselves. They just arrive glowing and full of truth. And sometimes that truth doesn't fit inside a cathedral. By not showing the true forms of these beings, the church controls the story. If the average person saw a painting of an angel with 4 faces and 1,000 eyes, they might ask questions. They might wonder what else has been left out. They might realize that heaven is stranger than they were told and maybe even closer. There's also fear. If people knew what angels really looked like, they might stop thinking of them as safe. They might stop praying for quiet comfort and start preparing for thunder. Because real angels don't just protect. They judge. They destroy. They carry messages that can change your life forever and not always in the way you want. So the most powerful angels remain hidden. Not because they aren't real, but because they're too real, too much, too honest. And maybe that's the point. Maybe their silence in the churches is their way of staying pure. Refusing to be tamed. Refusing to be turned into symbols. But if you listen closely in quiet moments, in dreams, in the spaces between thoughts, you might still feel them. Watching, waiting, wings unseen, truth unspoken. Just beyond the edge of the story we were told. Names have power. Everyone knows that. From the beginning of time, knowing the true name of something meant you could call it, summon it, bind it, or release it. In ancient texts, angels weren't just messengers with wings. They were forces of light, sound, and fire. And their names weren't just labels. They were keys, codes, a direct line to something beyond human understanding. Which is why, over the centuries, many of those names were erased. At first, people spoke them freely. Not out of disrespect, but out of awe. In the early days of Jewish and Christian mysticism, there were entire lists of angelic names, dozens of theme, each tied to a purpose. Healing, justice, time, weather, dreams. Some were believed to guard the stars. Others guided the souls of the dead. Each name had a sound, a rhythm, a meaning. And, when said with intention, that name was said to draw the angel closer. But that's where the trouble began. The church didn't like the idea of regular people having that kind of access. If anyone could speak an angel's name and ask for help or insight, what would happen to the priests? The hierarchy? The idea that only the church could connect you to the divine. Slowly, certain names were deemed too risky, too strange, too unknown. And just like that, they disappeared from prayers, from liturgy, from public speech. Only a few names were allowed to stay. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. The safe ones. The ones mentioned directly in Scripture. But what about the rest? Names like Uriel, Ragiel, Sariel, Ramailans, honored in early texts like the Book of Enoch were quietly removed from public worship. In some traditions, even speaking them became forbidden. Not because they were evil, but because they were unpredictable. There's a story from an old manuscript where a monk supposedly called on an angel whose name had been lost to time. The angel came, but not gently. Books flew off shelves. Candles blew out. The room shook. The monk never spoke the name again. The idea was simple. These names were not to be used lightly. They weren't passwords. They were invitations. Other traditions say that some angels were so powerful, their names had to be hidden for our protection. Not because the angels were bad, but because humanity wasn't ready. That speaking the true name of a throne, a seraph, or a cherubim could unravel a mind or break a body. that some names aren't meant for words, only for thought. But maybe the scariest thing wasn't the angels. It was what would happen if people realized they didn't need a middleman to reach heaven. That they could call on the light directly. That they were never alone. So the names were buried. Some in forbidden texts. Some carved into stone. Some passed down in whispers between mystics and dreamers. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear one. A sound that doesn't quite fit this world. A name that isn't a word but a key. And once you speak it, something wakes up. Not in the sky. In you. In the earliest days of human history, before kingdoms, before cathedrals, there were stories whispered around fires about beings who came from the sky. Not gods, not demons, but something in between. Angels. Specifically, a group known as the Watchers. And these weren't the kind of angels who just showed up to deliver messages and disappear in light. These angels stayed, taught, fell in love, and in doing so, they broke the rules of heaven forever. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers were sent to observe humanity. Nothing more. Their job was to watch the world unfold without interfering. But something unexpected happened. They grew attached. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe compassion, or maybe something deeper. Whatever it was, they couldn't stay distant. They crossed the line. And what they did next changed everything. They gave us knowledge. The Watchers taught humans how to make weapons from metal, how to read the stars, how to mix roots and herbs into Medicina poison. They shared secrets of writing, makeup, enchantment, and war. These weren't just survival tips. These were tools of power. The kind of knowledge that transforms civilizations. The kind that breaks chains. Some saw this as a gift. Others saw it as a curse. Because once people learned how to shape the world around them, they stopped being easy to control. They didn't have to wait for miracles. They could build, create, fight, and decide. That terrified the ones in charge, both in heaven and on earth. The Church has always been quiet about the Watchers. The Book of Enoch, which describes their story in detail, was removed from the Bible a long time ago. Declared non-canonical. Forgotten on purpose. Because if you believe that angels gave us forbidden knowledge, you start to wonder why that knowledge was forbidden in the first place. Who made that rule and why? What if the Watchers didn't fall out of pride but out of love? What if they broke the divine command because they believed humans had the right to grow, to understand, to choose? The Watchers paid a price. According to the legend, they were punished by God and cast into darkness. But their legacy didn't disappear. It lived on in symbols, stories, and scattered pieces of knowledge passed down through generations. It lived on in questions, in rebellion, in the quiet fire of those who refused to be ruled by ignorance. That's the heart of the story. Not angels with wings, but beings who chose us, who gave up eternity so we could have the tools to shape our own future. And maybe that's why their story was buried. Not because it was evil, but because it reminded people they didn't need to wait for permission to change their world. The Watchers made us harder to control, and in doing so, they might have made us truly human. It sounds strange at first, almost backwards, but at some point in history, the devil became less dangerous than the truth. A clear villain, a dark figure with horns and fire, tempting souls and ruling hell. That idea was actually easier for the Church to manage than what came before. Because before the devil became a cartoon of evil, the world of angels and divine beings was complicated, messy, full of mystery, and people were asking too many questions. In early texts, angels weren't soft guardians. They were terrifying forces of light. Some obeyed, some rebelled, some delivered messages so powerful they left prophets speechless or blind. The lines between good and bad weren't clean. Even the ones on heaven's side sometimes disobeyed. Some, like the Watchers, taught humans forbidden knowledge. Others questioned commands. These weren't characters from a fairy tale. They were beings with power and with choice. But that kind of complexity made things harder for the Church. If divine beings had free will, then heaven wasn't a place of perfect order. If some angels taught humans how to think for themselves, maybe rebellion wasn't always evil. Maybe it was necessary. And if truth came from all directions, from dreams, visions, fallen angels, even inner voices, then people didn't need a priest to find it. That's where the devil came in. By creating a single enemy with a simple goal: temptation, sin, destruction, the Church gave people a target, someone to fear, someone to blame. Lucifer was cast as the ultimate villain, fallen from heaven, ruling over hell, whispering lies to humans. But that version wasn't always part of the story. In older writings, Lucifer wasn't evil in the way we picture now. He was called the morning star, a bearer of light. His fall was about pride. Yes, but it was also about knowledge, about wanting to be more. That idea was dangerous. Too close to the Watchers. Too close to the stories of angels who helped humans grow. So instead of explaining that some divine beings had complex motives, the Church painted Lucifer as pure evil. No shades of gray. No questions. It worked. A clear enemy meant the Church could position itself as the only safe path. If the devil was out to trick you, then the Church would protect you. But behind that simple story, something deeper was lost: the truth. That not all rebellion is wicked, not all questions are sinful, and not every light comes from the same place. The devil became safer than the truth because he was easier to control. A villain you could point at, a figure to scare children. Meanwhile, the real danger, the freedom to think, to ask, to wonder, was buried under rituals and rules. But that freedom never died. It shows up in hidden books, in dreams, in the strange silence between what we're told and what we feel. And sometimes what looks like darkness is just light that hasn't been explained yet. The Church gave the world a devil. But what it really feared was the spark of truth that no one can unsee once it's lit. There's a reason the Jesuits have been called the Vatican's shadow. Founded in 1540, the Society of Jesus wasn't just about preaching or helping the poor. It was a movement with a mission: intellectual, global, and deeply strategic. They were teachers, missionaries, scientists. But more than anything, they were the Church's silent editors. Especially when it came to things that were hard to explain. Things like angels. By the 1500s, the world was changing fast. New lands were being discovered. Ancient texts were being uncovered. Mystics and scholars were questioning everything from astronomy to scripture. And people were starting to talk more freely again about angels, not just the soft ones from Sunday sermons, but the dangerous ones, the ones with secrets, with power, with stories that didn't always fit inside the Church's walls. The Jesuits saw the danger and they knew exactly what to do. They didn't burn books. Not always. They studied them, translated them, rewrote them. They didn't silence stories. They rephrased them. They took wild, unpredictable angel lore from forgotten scrolls and gave it boundaries, definitions, limits. They turned chaos into categories, and slowly they reshaped what the world believed. They pushed the idea of a fixed hierarchy. 9 choirs of angels, neatly ranked, each with a job, each answering to the next. They brought order to a world that once believed angels could appear anywhere to anyone without warning or permission. That wildness was removed. In its place came rules. They also limited the names. Before there had been dozens, some known, some whispered. Uriel, Ramiel, Siriel. Names that appeared in Enoch, in mystic visions, in Gnostic texts. But after the Jesuits worked their way through the theology books and seminaries, only 3 names were allowed to remain: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Everyone else was wiped from the list. Not because they weren't real, but because they were unpredictable, too connected to forbidden knowledge, too hard to control. The Jesuits believed they were protecting the faith, that they were guarding people from error, confusion, even spiritual danger. But what they were really doing was narrowing the sky, closing the door on the parts of heaven that didn't follow Rome's plan. They studied older stories, ancient Hebrew texts, Greek translations, apocryphal writings, and they quietly edited the ones that gave too much power to angels or to the people who spoke to them. If a mystic claimed an angel revealed something that didn't match church teaching, that vision was reclassified, downgraded, or buried. And the strangest part? Most people never noticed. Today, when someone imagines an angel, they're usually picturing a version shaped by Jesuit influence. Calm, controlled, a symbol of faith, not a source of revelation. But if you go back far enough, dig deep enough, you'll find another story. One where the skies weren't safe or simple, where angels weren't decorations but messengers of fire, voices of change, reminders that the divine couldn't be contained. The Jesuits didn't erase the angels. They just taught us to stop listening. Beneath the streets of Vatican City, past thick stone walls and guarded doors, lies a place few people have ever seen, the secret archive. It's not just shelves of old letters or forgotten maps. It's a vault of history, millions of pages that the Church keeps sealed away. And inside, according to whispers from scholars and ex-priests, are texts that speak of angels in ways the world was never meant to hear. These aren't fairy tales or fiction. They're ancient testimonies, scrolls, manuscripts written by early mystics, monks, travelers, and theologians who saw or heard something different, something dangerous, angels who didn't follow the rules, beings of light that delivered messages the Church refused to repeat, accounts of encounters that challenged the neat hierarchy the Vatican spent centuries building. Some of these texts are said to come from lost Gospels, others from Jewish mysticism or Gnostic communities that believed angels were more than just heavenly mail carriers. They were rebels, teachers, judges. Some operated beyond even the authority of what we think of as God. Others were caught in a cosmic struggle so vast it made the devil look like a side character. There are stories of angels who argued with God's commands to protect human freedom, of others who revealed the blueprint of the cosmos show. Stars and souls and time itself were linked. One text allegedly describes an angelic being that spoke in symbols of sound and fire, warning a monk that the Church would one day trade truth for power. That scroll never made it into public hands. But the monk's notes, smuggled out centuries later, hint at what it contained. Why hide these stories? Because if angels can act on their own, if they can disagree with heaven or help humans access forbidden knowledge, then the Church loses its role as the gatekeeper. The idea that only saints or popes can hear from the divine falls apart. And if the cosmic hierarchy is more like a shifting battlefield than a perfect order, then who really holds authority? Some believe that the Vatican didn't destroy these texts because they feared their power. Not just spiritual power, but the power of truth. A truth that might ignite the imagination, that might wake people up. Better, they thought, to bury it, lock it away, seal the vault with silence. Even now, researchers who request access to certain documents are turned away. Files go missing. Records are redacted. And whenever someone gets too close to what's inside the archive, the answers stop. But the questions don't. What if some of the angels we've forgotten were never forgotten by accident? What if their stories are still there, ink pressed into parchment, waiting for someone brave enough to read them again? Maybe that's the real reason the archive is hidden. Not because it holds lies, but because it holds the parts of heaven we were never supposed to remember. In 1917, 3 children in Fatima, Portugal, claimed to have visions that would change the world. They said the Virgin Mary appeared to them in a field, surrounded by light, and gave them secrets about the future. These messages became known as the 3 Secrets of Fatima. The Church officially confirmed 2 of them. One was about the end of World War I, another warned of World War II, and the dangers of communism. But the 3rd secret, that one was kept hidden for over 80 years. And even when it was finally revealed, something still didn't feel right. Because before Mary ever appeared, the children said they were visited by someone else. An angel. He wasn't smiling. He didn't offer comfort. He appeared suddenly, like a flash of light, holding a sword that burned like fire. According to Lucia, the oldest of the 3 children, the angel hovered in the air and pointed the flaming blade toward the earth. It wasn't a message of peace. It was a warning, a vision of judgment. The angel told them to pray, to do penance. Not because heaven was angry, but because something massive was coming. A shift, collapse, a consequence. And this wasn't symbolic. The children were so overwhelmed by what they saw. They cried. They trembled. They stopped talking about it for months. Not because they didn't believe it, but because it terrified them. This part of the Fatima visions, the angel with the sword, is rarely discussed in church sermons. It doesn't fit the story of soft devotion and holy miracles. It doesn't comfort people. It challenges them. It says, heaven is not asleep, that judgment is real, and that angels aren't just glowing figures from Christmas cards. They are warriors, watchers, sentinels with purpose. Many believe the 3rd secret of Fatima was never fully released. When the Vatican finally published it in 2000, it described a vision of a bishop in white being killed, cities in ruin, and a world covered in suffering. But it felt vague, incomplete. Even high-ranking clergy who read the real secret decades earlier said what was revealed was not all there was. Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, hinted that parts were left out. Others claim the missing lines involved not Mary, but the angel. So why hide that? Because a prophecy of war, collapse, and judgment, delivered by an angel, doesn't just shake political powers. It shakes the church. It reminds people that the divine isn't always gentle, that angels don't come to make us comfortable. They come to wake us up, and that some truths are so sharp, they have to be carried on a sword. Maybe that's why the angel at Fatima still feels like a shadow present, but unnamed, because he didn't come to bring peace. He came to warn us what happens when we forget where we come from, when we stop listening, and when we mistake silence for safety. High on a mountain in Arizona, surrounded by pines and stars, sits one of the last things you'd expect the Vatican to own: a massive telescope. It's called the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, and it's part of the Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world. Yes, the same church that once put Galileo on trial now quietly scans the heavens through some of the most advanced space-gazing equipment on Earth. But what are they really looking for? Most people think it's just science. Tracking comets, studying galaxies, mapping the movement of stars, and sure, that's part of it. But beneath the surface, there's a deeper layer, a quieter mission, one that has everything to do with what the church won't say out loud. The link between the heavens above and the beings said to come from them. Angels. For centuries, the church has taught that angels are spiritual beings, not tied to space or time. But in early writings and ancient law, the picture was more complicated. Angels weren't just messengers. They were watchers of the skies, guardians of the stars. Some texts describe them as beings who move between realms, who appear with light, thunder, and fire, descriptions that sound eerily close to how modern people talk about unidentified aerial phenomena. Now think about this. Why would the church, with all its history of controlling the flow of information, invest in the secrets of the stars? Because space isn't just emptiness. It's the oldest symbol of the divine, the place where heaven touches creation. And if angels are real, and they come from somewhere, then understanding the structure of the cosmos might reveal something the church has worked hard to keep quiet. The Vatican Observatory doesn't publicly talk about angelology, but behind the scenes, its history is tangled with it. Some of the church's most respected thinkers believed that stars had spirits, that the movement of planets reflected battles in heaven, that celestial beings could guide entire civilizations from the sky. Not metaphorically, literally. Old mystical texts claimed that each star had an angel assigned to it, that the hosts of heaven mentioned in the Bible were not poetic. They were ranks of actual entities operating in the vastness of space. Even St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the Church's greatest minds, wrote that angels could influence the physical world through celestial bodies. So maybe the Vatican's observatory isn't just about measuring starlight. Maybe it's also about monitoring what the ancients knew and what modern science is just starting to rediscover. That the universe isn't empty, that it's alive with intelligence. And maybe that's why the church stays so quiet about what it finds. Because if the stars are full of watchers, and if those watchers are still watching us, then the truth isn't just out there, it's getting closer. And the eyes, looking up from that mountaintop, aren't just searching for answers. They're making sure we're ready to hear them. Not every vision is welcome. Even in a faith built on miracles and messengers, some stories hit too close to the truth. The church has always celebrated saints who saw angels, so long as their visions stayed within the lines. But what happens when someone sees too much, or says something that doesn't match what the priests expect? That's when the silence begins. They're called experiencers. People who claim they were visited, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in waking life. They don't all wear robes or live in monasteries. Some were just farmers, children, women, outsiders. People with no authority, but a powerful, undeniable encounter. They described angels with eyes like fire, voices like thunder, messages that weren't soft comfort, but challenges, warnings, and sometimes These angels said things that flat out clashed with church teachings. The reaction wasn't celebration. It was control. Take Marguerite Porete, a mystic in the 13th century. She wrote about divine love and direct contact with the divine. She claimed that true union with God required no priests or sacraments. She said that heavenly beings had shown her this path. The church burned her at the stake. Or consider Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century thinker who documented hundreds of encounters with angels. He described entire layers of heaven, complete with hierarchies and laws that didn't match official doctrine. The church labeled him a heretic. His writings were banned in many places. Even Saint Joan of Arc, celebrated now, as a Catholic heroine, was condemned in her time. She said angels guided her, spoke to her, gave her commands that changed the course of war. But the voices she followed didn't come from bishops. They came from above. And for that, she was tried for heresy and burned. The pattern is always the same. As long as a vision supports the church's power, it's embraced. But when it opens new doors, when it encourages people to seek their own path to the divine, it's shut down. Labeled demonic, forgotten. What makes these stories even more powerful is how consistent they are. Across cultures and centuries, people describe the same things. Radiant beings, eyes like suns, wings that shimmer like lightning, and most of all, a feeling not of fear, but of overwhelming truth. A truth so deep it doesn't need words. But truth is dangerous when it can't be managed. So the church found ways to silence the experiences. They rewrote their stories, declared them mentally unstable, hid their writings in archives, or destroyed them completely. Over time, the memory of these people faded. Their encounters were buried. Yet the silence never quite held. Pieces of their visions survived in journals, in local legends, in symbols carved into the walls of forgotten chapels. And today, their voices are starting to rise again. Because you can silence a person but not the light they saw. In the 1500s, an English scholar named John Dee claimed he discovered a language that wasn't human. He said it came from angels. Dee was no ordinary man. He was Queen Elizabeth I's personal advisor, a scientist, a mathematician, and a seeker of forbidden knowledge. With his partner Edward Kelly, he spent years recording strange symbols, sounds, and words he said were dictated by beings of light. The language became known as Enochian, named after the ancient figure Enoch, the same one who supposedly walked with angels and was taken into heaven without dying. To this day, no one can fully explain where Enochian came from. It's a full system, an alphabet, a grammar, even its own syntax. It doesn't match any known ancient or modern language. Dee and Kelly claimed the angels taught it to them to prepare humanity for a coming transformation, a time when old truths would rise again. They believed the words carried power, not just meaning, but vibration. That speaking them out loud could shift reality, unlock hidden realms, open gates between the physical world and something far older. That scared people. It still does. The church has always been deeply suspicious of angelic languages, not because they doubt the power, but because they can't control it. If someone can speak directly to the heavens using a language outside of Scripture, what happens to the role of priests? What happens to the Vatican's authority? What if truth isn't only found in Latin hymns, but in whispered phrases no one remembers teaching? That's why Enochian and other so-called angelic tongues have mostly survived in the shadows inside grimoires. Hidden symbols in cathedrals, or buried in occult traditions passed down in secret. Some say the language is a Chaldean map to knowledge buried in time. Others believe it's not a language at all, but a technology, a spiritual system that when used correctly can open the mind to the divine. There are even stories of people who claim that when they meditate or dream, Enochian words come to them, words they've never studied, but somehow understand, like a memory they didn't know they had. That's the strange thing about angelic languages. They don't just communicate ideas, they activate something, as if we once knew them, as if part of us still does. Some researchers have tried to dismiss Enochian as fantasy, made-up symbols, nonsense. But if that were true, why do the same shapes and sounds keep showing up in different cultures across time? Why do sacred scripts from Sumer, Egypt, and India echo similar patterns? Maybe angelic languages aren't inventions, maybe they're remnants, leftovers from a time when the veil between heaven and earth was thinner, when angels didn't whisper, they spoke, and their words weren't just heard, they were felt. Now, imagine what might happen if someone found the key again, not just to read the language, but to speak it, and what might answer when they do. When angels show up in ancient stories, they don't give sermons. They don't beg people to follow rules. They don't talk about loyalty to kings or blind obedience to laws. Instead, they deliver messages that shake the ground beneath people's feet. They interrupt lives, they challenge the status quo, and sometimes they leave behind nothing but fire and questions. That's what makes them so powerful and so dangerous to anyone who wants to stay in control. The Church often talks about obedience as the highest virtue. Obey God, obey the Church, obey the system. But when you really look at how angels behave in the oldest texts, they're not there to keep people in line. They're there to wake people up, to tell them when something big is happening, to push them to act, to say the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Take Gabriel, for example. When he appears to Mary, he doesn't say, "Obey your leaders." He says something insane, that she, a teenage girl from a poor village, is going to carry the divine inside her. He doesn't ask permission, he doesn't follow protocol. He gives her a truth that breaks every rule of her world. And what does she do? She says yes, not out of obedience, but out of courage. Then there's the angel who appears to Joseph in a dream. Joseph had every legal right to abandon Mary after finding out she was pregnant. But the angel tells him something different, something risky. He listens not because he's following a law, but because the message speaks to something deeper than rules. Over and over, angels show up in moments where people are stuck between what they're supposed to do and what they know is right. The angelic message never says, "Just do what you're told." It says, "Look again, listen deeper, trust the light you feel even if no one else sees it." That's a threat to any authoritarian power, because authoritarians rely on obedience to survive. They want people to follow without asking why. They want people to believe that questioning is dangerous. But angels don't play by those rules. They don't care about politics or rank or even religious authority. If truth needs to be said, they say it. If a system is rotten, they call it out. And if someone's life is about to change forever, they bring the fire whether the person is ready or not. It's no surprise that stories of real angelic encounters are often dismissed or buried, because a true angel doesn't make people more obedient, it makes them more free. And freedom terrifies those in power far more than any sword or flame. That's the secret the Church never says out loud. Real angels don't demand obedience. They spark rebellion, the kind that begins in the soul and spreads like light. There's one angel most people don't talk about, He doesn't bring comfort. He doesn't offer hope. He brings endings. In ancient apocalyptic texts, especially the ones buried or ignored by the Church, there's a figure known only as the Angel of the Last Days. And he doesn't come to fight demons or save the faithful. He comes to tear down the systems that betrayed the truth. He's not gentle. He doesn't whisper. When he appears, the skies darken. The earth shakes. His voice is described like a trumpet blast that splits mountains and sets cities on fire. Some say his wings stretch from horizon to horizon. Others say he has no form at all, just blinding light and unbearable sound. But everyone agrees on one thing. He doesn't serve any throne made by men. In these ancient visions, this angel arrives when the world is bloated with lies, when temples are filled with gold, but empty of spirit, when the keepers of faith have traded mystery for money and silence for power. He doesn't destroy because he's evil. He destroys because rot has taken root where truth was meant to grow. And the first thing he brings down? Religion, not faith, not the divine, but the institutions that claim to speak for heaven while keeping heaven locked in a cage. The churches that silence questions. The leaders who wear robes of purity while hiding corruption. The voices that preach obedience while hoarding knowledge. The angel of the last days cuts through all of it. In some texts, he is called the cleanser of altars. In others, the breaker of seals. He walks through cathedrals and sanctuaries not to worship, but to reveal, to show what's been hidden, to unmask those who stand between the people and the light. That's why his story was buried. Because he doesn't protect the powerful. He doesn't bless the system. He's not part of the heavenly choir that sings praises. He's the one who blows the final trumpet. The one who declares the end not of the world, but of the illusion. Some mystics say he's already here, not as a person but as a force, a movement, a fire spreading in the hearts of those who are tired of being lied to, who know that something sacred has been stolen, and who feel deep inside that the old ways are falling apart. He doesn't ask for worship. He demands truth, and when he moves, nothing fake can survive. Not the polished speeches, not the gold-covered books, not the rituals designed to keep people asleep. His presence strips everything bare. What's left after he passes through? Whatever's real. That's why he's feared. Because the angel of the last days isn't coming to punish. He's coming to reveal what's been true all along. And when he does, even the tallest towers of religion will tremble. Not because heaven has abandoned us, but because it's finally come home. We're told angels fight for the good side, that they stand with the righteous, that they protect the holy and punish the wicked. But what happens when the people claiming to speak for God are the ones doing the most damage? What if the church itself, the one building statues to angels and printing their names in stained glass, isn't on the side of the light anymore? That's the question no one wants to ask, because it leads to a place that's uncomfortable, a place where the symbols we've been taught to trust start to twist, and where the army of heaven might not be coming to defend the institution, but to dismantle it. In ancient texts and forgotten prophecies, angels are described as messengers of truth. Not loyalty, not blind faith, truth. And truth doesn't bow to titles or robes or cathedrals. It doesn't care if someone wears a sits on a throne. Truth walks straight into the room, no matter who's sitting at the top. And that's why some of the most apocalyptic visions in history show angels not guarding churches, but judging them. In one ancient vision, an angel stands at the door of a temple with a sword of fire, not to protect it, but to stop people from entering. The reason? The temple had become corrupt. Its leaders had twisted the sacred into a business. They were selling forgiveness, silencing questions, and using fear to stay in power. Sound familiar? Other mystics wrote of dreams where angels wept not for the lost, but for the faithful. People who had given their lives to a church that no longer served the divine. People who prayed to God, but were actually being led in circles by men chasing control. In these visions, the angels didn't punish those people, they freed them. They shattered the systems that kept them small and afraid. But not everyone was spared. The ones who claimed to represent God but lied, covered up truths, hid sacred books, silenced voices, those were the ones the angels opposed. Not because they were atheists or rebels, but because they had taken something pure and turned it into a weapon. This is the real theological crisis. Not that angels might not help us, but that they might come to fight against us, or at least against the things we built in God's name that don't actually belong to Him. It's a hard truth, but maybe it's also a hopeful one. Because if heaven still cares enough to send its warriors, that means the story isn't over. That means there's still time to remember what faith was before it got institutionalized, before it was boxed in and priced out. Maybe the scariest possibility isn't that heaven's army has abandoned us. Maybe it's that they're finally on their way, and they're not here to take sides. They're here to clean house. Imagine this, a world where you don't need a priest to find God, where you don't need a church to feel the divine, where the voice that guides your soul doesn't come from the pulpit, but from something older, louder, and more real. Now, imagine that voice isn't human at all. It's an angel, a being of fire and light and ancient memory, and it's speaking directly to you. That's the Vatican's greatest fear, because for centuries the Church has been the middleman, the bridge between heaven and earth. It built rituals, ranks, and rules to make sure people only heard from God through the proper channels. Priests, bishops, popes. You want forgiveness? Go to confession. You want truth? Read their version of the Bible. You want guidance? Trust the sermon. The entire system depends on control. But angels don't ask for permission. They don't wait for Sunday. They don't show up in cathedrals with incense and choir music. They come to shepherds in fields, to kids in forests, to mystics in caves. They speak in dreams, visions, fire, wind, and lightning. And what they say often doesn't match what the Church teaches, because they don't represent the Church. They represent truth. That's why throughout history, the most powerful spiritual experiences, the ones that changed lives and started revolutions, didn't come from bishops. They came from direct encounters with the divine. And many of those encounters started with angels. Think of Joan of Arc, who said angels told her to lead an army. Think of the children of Fatima, warned by a sword-wielding angel. Think of the mystics and saints who were told things by heavenly beings that didn't line up with church dogma, were either silenced or burned for it. The fear isn't just that people might hear angels. It's that they might start listening. Because once you realize the divine doesn't need a building to speak, or a collar to deliver a message, the whole structure begins to shake. Why pay tithes when you're already being guided by something higher? Why kneel to human authority when a being of light calls you by name? The Vatican has spent centuries drawing lines. Who's allowed to speak? What visions are acceptable? Which books are canon? But angels don't care about canon. They don't follow orders from Rome. They follow something older. And if the world remembered that even for a moment it could all fall apart. The hierarchy, the power, the gatekeeping. Because the truth has always been right there, waiting. In the wind, in the silence, in the burning edge of a dream. All it takes is one moment, one voice from beyond, one person brave enough to believe what they heard instead of what they were told. That's the real threat, because once people remember they can hear heaven for themselves, they'll never need permission again. Long ago, before the flood, before the church, before even the Bible as we know it was written, there were beings called the Watchers. They were angels, powerful, brilliant, and not entirely obedient. Their job was to observe humanity from above, to watch, not interfere. But they broke that rule. They came down. They taught us things, secrets, knowledge we weren't supposed to have. According to the Book of Enoch, a text so dangerous it was banned from the Bible, the Watchers gave humans the tools of civilization. They taught us how to shape metal, read the stars, heal wounds, and cast spells. They opened our eyes, but their gifts came with a price. War, greed, rebellion, and for breaking the divine order, the Watchers were punished, cast into darkness, sealed away, waiting. But what if that wasn't the end? What if the Watchers are returning? All over the world, people are seeing strange lights in the sky, hearing voices in dreams, waking up with knowledge they never studied. Scientists are discovering patterns in nature that look like messages. Mathematicians talk about codes hidden in the universe itself. Mystics say the veil between worlds is thinning, that someone is coming back. Maybe it's not aliens. Maybe it's not hallucinations. Maybe it's them. If the Watchers really are returning, the question isn't just why. It's what will they say this time? Because the first time they handed us the tools to build and destroy. Now, thousands of years later, we've built cities that touch the sky and weapons that could erase everything. Maybe the Watchers are here to correct us, or maybe they're here to finish what they started. And here's the part that scares the Church. If the Watchers return, they won't go to the Vatican. They won't ask for permission. They'll come to those who are ready to listen, the quiet ones, the dreamers, the seekers. And when they speak, their voices won't follow the rules of religion. They never did. They'll talk about forgotten histories, about truth that was buried, about powers humans still carry inside themselves. That's what the Vatican fears most. Because once the Watchers speak again, people might stop believing the official version of everything, of God, of heaven, of what it means to be human. And they might start remembering. So watch the skies. Listen to your dreams. Pay attention to the feeling that something ancient is waking up. Because the Watchers were never demons. They were never saints. They were something else. And they might be coming back not to save us, but to remind us what we used to know. Before the world forgot, they never came to fit inside stained glass. They never asked to be painted with soft feathers or gentle smiles. Real angels, the ones spoken of in ancient texts, the ones whispered about in forbidden books, are something entirely different. They don't bring comfort. They bring truth. And truth doesn't whisper. It roars. From the beginning, angels were never meant to be controlled. Not by kings. Not by churches. Not by anyone. They move with the weight of stars and the fire of creation. And when they arrive, they don't knock politely. They break the silence. They shatter illusions. They tear open the curtain between what we believe and what actually is. Maybe that's why they've been hidden. Because the world we live in is built on careful lies. Stories we were told to keep us safe. Rules we were taught to follow without question. Histories written by those in power. Visions edited to match the doctrine. But angels don't play by those rules. They carry a message older than language. A truth that doesn't need permission to be heard. That's why they've always terrified the powerful. Because an angel doesn't ask you to obey. It asks you to see. To see the systems that use faith as a leash. To see the knowledge buried under fear. To see that maybe the divine has been with you this whole time, waiting for you to stop looking up and start looking within. The church built its power by standing between heaven and earth. By claiming to be the translator, the gatekeeper. But what happens when the message comes directly to you? What happens when wings stretch across your dreams and a voice that feels like lightning whispers? Not from a pulpit, but from the silence inside your own soul. That's when everything begins to unravel. And maybe that's exactly what's supposed to happen. Because the arrival of true messengers doesn't mark the end of faith. It marks the end of control. It's the moment when lies can no longer survive. When masks fall off. When the golden crowns rust. When the loudest voices go silent and the quiet ones finally speak. Not all angels come with warnings, but all of them come with truth. And once you've heard it, you can't go back. You start to question what you were taught. You start to remember things you never learned. You start to feel the shift. Maybe it's already begun. Maybe the fire isn't coming. It's already here. Moving through dreams, through doubt, through the spaces where silence used to live. And when the truth finally arrives, wrapped in wings and impossible light, no institution will be able to contain it. Not even the Vatican. Because truth doesn't need a throne. It only needs someone willing to listen. Thank you so much for watching. See y'all in the next one video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.